Good evening. Welcome to the Black Conservative Voice with David Colbert here on the CTM News Network, the voice of truth. Well, we got some interesting news to talk about today. There was a video released. U.S. Republican Louis Gohmert of Tyler, Texas, is calling on the U.S. House of Representatives to ban Democrats and any organization or political party that ever publicly supported slavery or Confederate State of America.
Raising a question of the privileges of the House, whereas on July 22nd, 2020, House Resolution 7573 was brought to the House floor for a vote with the purpose of eliminating 4 specific statues or busts from the United States Capitol, along with all others that include individuals who, quote, served as an officer or voluntarily with the Confederate States of America or the military forces or government of a state while the state was in rebellion against the United States, unquote, yet failed to address the most ever-present historical stigma of the United States Capitol. That is the source that so fervently supported, condoned, and fought for slavery that was left untouched, but without whom the evil of slavery could never have continued as it did, to such extreme that it is necessary to address here in order for the U.S. House of Representatives to avoid degradation of historical fact and blatant hypocrisy for generations to come. Whereas the Democratic Party platform of 1840, 1844, 1848, 1852, and 1856 states, quote, that Congress has no power under the Constitution to interfere with or control the domestic institutions of the several states, and that such states are the sole and proper judges of everything appertaining to their own affairs, not prohibited by the Constitution, that all efforts of the abolitionists or others made to induce Congress to interfere with questions of slavery are calculated to lead to the most alarming and dangerous consequences, and that all such efforts have an inevitable tendency to diminish the happiness of the people and endanger the stability and permanency of the Union, and ought not to be countenanced by any friend of our political institutions, unquote, again from the Democratic Party platform of those years. Whereas the Democratic Party platform of 1856 further declares that new states to the Union should be admitted, quote, with or without domestic slavery as the state may elect, unquote. Whereas the Democratic Party platform of 1856 also resolves that, quote, we recognize the right of the people of all the territories to form a constitution with or without domestic slavery, whereas the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 penalized officials who did not arrest an alleged runaway slave and made them liable for a fine of $1,000, which is about $28,000 in present-day value. Law enforcement officials everywhere were required to arrest people suspected of being a runaway slave on as little as a claimant's sworn testimony of ownership. The Democratic Party platform of 1860, directly in seeking to uphold the Fugitive Slave Act, states that, quote, the enactments of the state legislatures to defeat the faithful execution of the Fugitive Slave Law are hostile in character, subversive of the Constitution, revolutionary in their effect, unquote. The Democratic Party platform again. Whereas the 14th Amendment giving full citizenship to freed slaves passed in 1868 with 94% Republican support, 0% Democratic support in Congress. The 15th Amendment giving freed slaves the right to vote passed in 1870 with 100% Republican support and 0% Democratic support in Congress, whereas Democrats systematically suppressed African Americans' right to vote by the specific example in the 1902 Constitution of the state of Virginia, actually disenfranchised about 90% of the black men who still voted at the beginning of the 20th century and nearly half of the white men, so they suppressed Republican voters as well. The number of eligible African American voters were thereby forcibly reduced from about 147,000 in 1901 to about 10,000 by 1905. That measure was supported almost exclusively by Virginia Democrats. And whereas the Virginia 1902 Constitution was engineered by Carter Glass, the future Democratic U.S. Representative, Senator, and Secretary of Treasury under Democrat President Woodrow Wilson, who proclaimed the goal of the Constitutional Convention as follows, quote, this Democrat exclaimed, quote, discrimination. Why, this is precisely what we propose. That's exactly what this convention was elected for, to discriminate to the very extremity of permissible action under the limits of the federal Constitution with a view toward elimination of every, and I won't use his word, but African American voter who can be gotten rid of legally, unquote, which was said by a Democrat and applauded by his fellow Democrats. Whereas in 1912, Democratic President Woodrow Wilson's administration began a racial segregation policy for U.S. government employees, and by 1914, the Wilson administration Civil Service instituted the requirement a photograph be submitted with each employment application. And whereas the 1924 Democratic National Convention convened in New York City at Madison Square Garden, the convention commonly was known as the Klan Bake due to the overwhelming influence of the Ku Klux Klan in the Democratic Party. And whereas in 1964, the Democratic Party led a 75 calendar day filibuster against the 1964 Civil Rights Act, whereas leading the Democrats in their opposition to civil rights for African Americans was a member of the Democratic Party, Senator Robert Byrd from West Virginia, who was a known recruiter for the Ku Klux Klan. Whereas Democrats enacted and enforced Jim Crow laws and civil codes that forced segregation, restricted freedoms of black Americans in the United States. Whereas on June 18, 2020, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi ordered the removal from the Capitol portraits of 4 previous speakers of the House who served in the Confederacy, saying that these portraits, quote, set back our nation's work to confront and combat bigotry, unquote. The men depicted in the portraits were Democrat Robert M.T. Hunter, Democrat Howell Cobb, Democrat James L. Orr, and Democrat Charles F. Crisp. Resolved that the Speaker of the House of Representatives shall remove any item that names, symbolizes, or mentions any political organization or party that has ever held a public position that supported slavery or the Confederacy from any area within the House wing of the Capitol or any House office building, and shall donate such item or symbol to the Library of Congress. And 2, that any political organization or party that has ever held a public position that supported slavery or the Confederacy shall either change its name or be barred from participation in the House of Representatives.
Calling on the House of Representatives to ban Democrats and any organization or political party that ever publicly supported slavery or Confederate States of America. The East Texas representative released the following statement through an opinion piece on Breitbart News on Thursday. And I quote, many on the left and their willing accomplices in the media would tell you otherwise, yet the cursory examination of our nation's factual history and records proves that the riots and chaos that have swept across our country in recent months stand as a devastating reminder of the racist policies and values held by the Democratic Party throughout much of its history. Because of this, I introduced a privileged resolution in the House calling upon Congress to acknowledge the indigenous history of the Democratic Party. I ask that Speaker of the House be instructed to ban any political organization or political party that ever publicly supported slavery or Confederate States of America. Since George Floyd's tragic death or killing on May 25th, the left, which includes their mainstream Democrats, have resurrected their push to rid our nation of any entities, symbols, or reminders of the repugnant aspect of America's past. Statues of American leaders have been torn down, defaced, and destroyed, regardless of whether they were a party to improprieties or fought against them. The liberal mob is out in full force demanding that schools, sports teams, music, arts, military installations, and even food products change their names if they have the slightest reference to any persons or events deemed unacceptable and offensive to the groupthink of the Marxist left. Democrats argue that they are compelled to take these extreme actions because of systematic racism in America, all while conveniently pinning blame on Republicans and conservatives. This revisionist history tells a story that simply has no basic or historical fact. Their efforts are a veiled attempt to erase the Democratic Party's own culpability, which was decades, if not centuries, was the ardent political advocate for discrimination and racism in our nation. For instance, when the Republicans overwhelmingly supported the 14th and 15th Amendment, which recognized former slaves as citizens and granted them as citizens the right to vote, every single Democrat in Congress voted against their passage at that time. Blocked passages to the same of the good done in our country's history. Further, as Bruce Bartlett points out in his book Wrong on Race, the Democratic Party buried past for centuries after Reconstruction. The Jim Crow laws were enacted by the Democratic legislatures and signed into law by Democratic governors. It could not have been otherwise, since there were virtually no Republicans, positions, or authority in state governments in the South after the end of the Reconstruction in 1877. However, Democrats' support for slavery and its subsequent support for institutional racism did not end in the 1800s. Elected in 1912, Democratic President Woodrow Wilson enacted policies to segregate the federal government. In a letter to the editor Howard Brigman, who criticized President Wilson in his publication for his support of segregation, Democrat Wilson voiced support for his administration enacted segregational policies, stating that I do approve, this is his quote, I do approve of segregation that being attempted in several of the departments. He went on to argue that segregation was distinctly to the advantage of blacks, which is of course an absurd claim. Absurd, steeped in blatant racism. When his administration began requiring that the photographs be submitted with each employment application, which was used to discriminate against minority applicants, President Wilson, to whom many current Democrats either point with pride or saying nothing, did nothing. They're the do-nothing Democrats, and they've always been doing it. Nearly 50 years later, when Republicans steadfastly supported the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Democrats filibustered, check your history, filibustered the bill for 75 calendar days. 75 calendar days. Republicans in Congress expended great effort to protect the basic rights promised to minorities in America by our nation's founders. During his 14-hour speech filibustering the Civil Rights Act, Democratic Senator Robert Byrd, a known KKK recruiter, proclaimed men are not created equal today, and they were not created equal in 1776. This is a quote from him. Men and races of men differ in appearance, ways, physical power, mental capacity, creativity, and vision. What does that sound like to you? This morally bankrupt view is what Democrats held for a majority of the party's history. That historically Democrat view is a total corruption of biblical view of the Republican Party, held that although we may look different, we are absolutely equal in the view of our Creator or the Almighty God, as a Republican President Lincoln liked to say. Oh, this president, that President Obama and so many others have pulled up and say, I don't like Lincoln. Lincoln was a Republican, people. He was a Republican. And regardless of what some might say, the Republican Party is the Republican Party, and the Democratic Party is the Democratic Party. They've been that way for over a century. So nothing's changed. The Democrats are still doing what they're doing. They're still trying to hurt the American people. On June 18th of this year, Speaker Nancy Pelosi ordered the removal of portraits from the Capitol building honoring 4 previous Speakers of the House, all of whom were Democrats. That was a good start on the job that she should now finish if she's going to avoid blatant hypocrisy. Throughout America's history, Republicans have fought to repeal Jim Crow laws, desegregate schools, and to promote racial equality in America. For those of you who think the Democrats were behind that, the Republicans were. So get your history and your facts straight. In recent years, Republicans, including President Trump, have continued this fight by working valiantly to lift Americans of all races out of poverty through pro-growth economic policies that have done more to help the plight of the impoverished than any administration ever has prior to the economic downturn caused by the created COVID-19 pandemic. I'm not saying it's not a disease, but I am saying it was created. If you look at your history as well, former President Obama in 2015 gave $3.7 billion to the Wuhan Chinese lab, along with Dr. Fauci. If you think your president was so great, he was behind the development of COVID-19. Try to say he wasn't. What did it come out of, people? It came out of the Wuhan labs. Didn't we hear that? There's even pictured with President Obama actually standing in the Wuhan laboratory. Unemployment rates for minorities were at record lows with employment record highs. Efforts by Democrats to destroy all public traces of their own history of supporting slavery, the Confederacy, and segregation in an attempt to shift blame onto the Republican Party must no longer go unchallenged. It is time for the Democrats to play by their own rules and accept the standards they have forced onto everyone else. They must divest themselves of their name that has denied so many the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Their recent actions demand nothing less. Instead of counseling our culture and history, It's time to cancel Democrats. They can no longer use that name because they are now known to be associated with slavery and trying to keep slavery going. And all the hurt and pain it caused in our African American history. Don't let them lie to you, African American people. Don't accept their lies anymore. Look at your history. I can guarantee they probably doctored a lot of it in books, but it is on record in our government that the Democratic Party did not want the Civil Rights Act of 1964, nor did they want the Emancipation Proclamation. They voted against all of it. 94% was Republicans on the Emancipation Proclamation. The ones against, 0 were voting for. The Democrats did not even vote for it. They refused to vote for the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves. And then even after that, they found ways to try to stop us from being free, even in the rights of the 14th and 15th Amendment, to be able to vote. In the state of Virginia, over there, they had 447,000 people who came out to vote, and that's black males who came out to vote that following year. And years after that, they figured out ways to manipulate things. So at some point, it got all the way down to 10,000 because they tried to find ways to disqualify the African American or the blacks from being able to vote in the elections. Oh yeah, now they're touting they want make sure we register the voters. Yes. Don't let them lie to you anymore, people. Let us vote for Republican Donald J. Trump. He has done, and his party has done more for this country's minorities than any other party in the history of this nation. Stop allowing the Democrats to lie to you and tell you that's not true, because it is true. When I saw Mr. Gohmert make this statement, there was no opposition to that statement because they could not deny the truth. And the Democratic Party can no longer be called the Democratic Party. What are we going to call them? Call them the Socialist Party or the Progressive Party. Change your name, Democratic Party, because that name, Democratic Party, is aligned with slavery and the oppression of blacks and other minorities in this country. Republican Lou Gohmert represents Texas' 1st Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives and is a senior member of the House Judiciary Committee. He is a former criminal court judge and former appellate court chief justice for the state of Texas. So he ain't just running his mouth. He knows what's going on. Now, I'm going to tell you, in November, you better vote President Trump back in office because the Democratic Party has a lot in store for making your life miserable. They want, of course, we all know they raise taxes every opportunity they get. So one of the first things they say they're going to do, they're going to change all the business regulations. Former Vice President Biden says he's going to raise taxes. He's going to push his Green New Deal. And the problem with the Democrats is that there are not enough rich people to pay for all their socialist agendas. Free health care, free college, the Great New Deal, infrastructure, and the list goes on. I did some math, a reporter said, and it seems to me that the price tag could exceed $80 trillion. Pure foolishness. You can confiscate all the wealth, all the billionaires and millionaires, and we will still come up way short of what is being promised by the Democratic Party through these Green New Deal and all these foolishness. Well, I'm going to tell you, I want us to vote in this election coming up for a great American. A great American. Not just an average American. And not just a politician. I am talking about Donald J. Trump. Donald J. Trump is for the American people. If you haven't seen it yet, then you're walking around with blinders on. And you're ignoring the facts. Please, my people, especially, African American people, stop ignoring the facts. The Democratic Party, from the very beginning, have tried to enslave you. They created these welfare policies through their leadership in government, these things that keep us in physical bondage and emotional bondage. I posted a quote recently by Marcus Garvey that says, there are people that can set your bodies free, but only you can free your mind. So free your mind. Free your mind. Stop listening to everything somebody else says and read the history for yourself. I have a brother that's an historian. But we need to pay attention to the history and stop listening to people who try to subvert the history. The Democratic Party has not changed. It's still the same Democratic Party. And somebody else has switched and went over to another party, wow, whatever. Every person has the right to do whatever they want to do. You have some to try to say, well, yeah, the old party used to be Republican. No, I'm sorry. The Democrats, regardless of whether they say the Republicans went to Democrats, makes no difference. The name Democratic Party has to be removed from the House of Representatives and from the members of this government because they were the ones who were behind the Confederacy. And everything that's in that thing has to be removed. They want to remove their statues? Well, you need to remove the name Democratic Party. Change yourself to the Progressive Party. Because that's what you keep calling yourself anyway. Well, let's call it that or call it something else. But that Democratic Party name hurts us as African Americans because you tried to kill us. You tried to destroy us. Told us we weren't as intelligent as whites back in the early days through Robert Byrd, the head of the KKK. So, you know, try to deny it all you will, Democratic Party, but it's there. It's in the history, and I thank Representative Goldberg of here in Texas of pointing out that fact. So please, let's stop ignoring it. The mainstream media hid the report. You didn't even see that in the regular news. That's because they don't want you to hear the truth because they're owned by the Democratic Party. The same slave owners that put us in slavery years ago and wanted to deny us the right to vote, want us to vote for them. How ironic. Okay, moving on. We want to elect our president, Donald J. Trump. We want to elect him again, and hopefully if his son's willing to run, or if Mike Pence is willing to run next term, we'll vote him in as well. We need to keep this country in a place where it's being governed by the people and for the people, not for somebody's pocketbook. President Trump came out recently and he canceled the Jacksonville Republican National Convention. He said that there will be events starting in North Carolina, an acceptance speech, but no large conventions in Jacksonville. Trump just announced, this was just the other day, that there would be no large in-person Republican National Convention in Jackson due to the threat of COVID-19, coronavirus. There will be events just no longer gathered originally planned. President Donald Trump said he will no longer hold a large in-person Republican convention in Jacksonville, Florida because of the coronavirus, but will hold virtual events and still give an acceptance speech. I told my team, quote, I told my team it's time to cancel Jacksonville, Florida component of the GOP convention. Well, we're going to take a break right now. We'll be back at you in a moment. You're watching Black Conservative Voice with David Colbert here on the CTM News Network, the voice of truth. Welcome back. You're watching the Black Conservative Voice with David Colbert here on the CTM News Network. President Trump goes on to say we will be starting in North Carolina for Monday, as has always been planned, and we were never taking that off. Trump said at the press conference at the White House Thursday afternoon. Trump said that it was not the right time for a big convention. adding that he had to protect the American people. Even though he wants these big conventions, he still has an interest in protecting the American people. I can pretty much guarantee you the Democrats would not have handled it that way. And I suggest a new name for the Democrats they want. And some people call yourself the Demon Crap. The Demon Craps. That'll change the name a bit, because that's the kind of stuff you're spreading, demonic stuff. And it's because we are in a war against God and our enemy. So, people making travel arrangements all over the country, they wanted to be there, he said. Trump plans for Jacksonville appeared to be in peril earlier this week when the city council president raised safety and health concerns and threatened to oppose the key funding bill for the convention. Trump said he had spoken with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis about his decision and said that he would still do a convention speech in a different form, not the arena event he had hoped for. He said that DeSantis did not ask him to cancel the event, but he decided to do it anyway for safety reasons and for the media backlash he thought he would receive. I'm not sure he had a lot of choice politically. A large gathering was too risky, even if there was no documentable spread because of it. While I think the polls are overstating Biden's lead, there's no doubt that Trump needs a restart. Having Brad Parscale, a campaign manager, was fighting last year, replacing them was right. He also needs to get control not only of the virus, but the virus narrative. If the economic comes back strong in the fall, Trump likely wins. If the economic turns south, which it won't, and an RNC convention takes the blame, he probably loses. But I don't believe that necessarily is the truth. And I believe really a lot of the stuff is dealing with what they intended to try to do. And that is to hurt President Trump's opportunity or chances to win the 2020 election. We're going to take a short break right now. We will be right back at you here on the Black Conservative Voice. This is David Colbert on the CTM News Network, the voice of truth. Welcome back. You're watching Black Conservative Voice on CTM News Network, the voice of truth. I just figured I want to go over a little bit more before I move away from this topic, because I didn't mention this and I want to mention this. I think I may have mentioned about the filibuster for 75 days on the Democratic Party against the Civil Rights Act. But however, Democrats' support for slavery and its subsequent support and institutionalized racism did not end in the 1800s, as I said earlier. And Woodrow Wilson, as Mr. Biden said once here recently, that President Trump was the first racist president. Pardon me, Mr. Biden. History surely points out that Democrat Woodrow Wilson was clearly the first racist president elected to office. It says here, President Woodrow Wilson enacted policies to segregate the federal government. He actually tried to segregate the federal government. If it was up to him, there would be no black congresspeople, no black senators, or any other race or minority would be in the Capitol. So do we want government like that to continue? And I just want to share this with people as you're listening in. If we keep this going the way it's going right now, you watch the riots and stuff in the streets, and I told you in the beginning that Act Blue, a Democratic fundraiser, is the ones who have supported Black Lives Matter. They did not deny it. And that Black Lives Matter is now a global organization who gets billions of dollars in funding. They have, and since you think it's just a little organization, they have staff that they pay over $15 billion or $15 million a year for their staff. This is a Marxist organization, an organized, socialized, socialist movement to defeat America within our own borders. They're local terrorists. That's what I call them. Local terrorists. Look at their activities. When you look at the mess that's going on in Portland and some of the other cities in this nation, it looks like terrorist activities in most of the countries that I've seen around the world. What do you think? Isn't that what it looks like? The same Marxist spirit that's behind all these things, like the people that are trying to deny Israel of their land, going around killing people. You know, I was really upset when I saw the commissioner of Chicago. It really saddened me. Mayor Lightfoot hires a black commissioner in Chicago. We send out our officers to protect the statue of Christopher Columbus. Do you realize that 49 police officers were injured by these people, quote unquote, Black Lives Matter? Because I don't believe that's who they are. I believe they're black. They're a Marxist organization as well. And they went out, froze bottles, froze cans, and were throwing at police. One police, it broke his eye socket. What is the purpose of this? If you have a crime being committed in your neighborhood and the police don't show up, guess what? They're just going to go on to the next person. And if you want to defund our police, guess what? Then I'll tell them where you live at, since you want to defund our police. We need to quit this foolishness in this country, and I am behind President Trump 100%. And you need to get behind our president. I have seen nothing in any of the policies that our president has set forth that hurt the American people. Not even those who have crossed the borders illegally. He's done nothing to those people. They lie, they try to put all these things up. You know, oh, he trapped the people's children in the camp down in so-and-so or whatever. I can guarantee you start looking at the records, look at things, you will find that a lot of these things they're accusing President Trump of are being backed by the Democratic Party. They've been underhanded, they've supported slavery, they supported segregation, and all these things since the beginning of this country.